back to my channel. My name is Ann Beverly. I own Blueberry Counseling Center here in beautiful McLean, Virginia. Today's guest is Dr. Jared Defife, and he is a psychologist out of Georgia, and he specializes in seeing men, and I'm going to let him explain a little bit more about his specialty. And of course, we're going to talk about food because we always do. That's the order of the day here at the Food Counselor channel. So Jared, do you mind giving a little intro about yourself, and then we can kind of dive in?
Thanks, Ann. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm Jared Defife. I'm a psychologist in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been in private practice for about 5 years now. I'm a recovering academic. I was in the academic world for many, many years before that. I specialize in my practice in working in kind of men's mental health. So I work with a lot of men who struggle with kind of depression, anxiety, marital concerns, things like that. I have a particular sort of sub-interest, and a number of my folks who I work with have come in with adult ADHD symptoms. Some have come because of that. Some may not have kind of known that when they come in. But that's an area of particular interest in mine, is helping adults with ADHD navigate the sort of interpersonal dynamics of it, the relational dynamics of it, the emotion regulation dynamics of it, as well as kind of get their lives in order.
Right. Yeah. So do you have like a DBT kind of focus, or you are more eclectic, or do you?
So my work with adults with ADHD is really an integrative type approach that spans, therapy for adults with ADHD is a sort of developing field and area. But what we found kind of tends to work with folks is an integrative approach that blends education about the condition, kind of like psychoed, so getting to know how the ADHD brain works. And we'll talk about that probably today in association with food and grocery shopping and things like that.
Yeah.
So the education piece, medication is usually a key component, and we may talk about how that affects people. A coaching kind of mindset, CBT for ADHD does talk about kind of coaching skills type stuff around like executive functioning, organizing one's life, keeping a calendar, time management, time awareness, those sorts of things.
Right.
But I also incorporate the emotional piece, which is a kind of interpersonally based, emotion-focused type approach, because a lot of folks with ADHD struggle with relationships in a big way. They struggle with their self-esteem in a big way.
Yeah.
And they also, little is known about this, I think, in the wider set, but the emotional component of ADHD is so important, because folks with ADHD tend to feel their emotions very, very intensely. They tend to struggle with things like irritability, anger, frustration, depression and anxiety, as well as a number of other kind of conditions. So we work on that from the kind of emotion-focused type interpersonal approach. DBT has been something that's been used skills-wise in that, but I tend to follow a pretty eclectic approach with that.
Okay, cool. And for those who don't know, I think we're using a lot of jargon. I just want to kind of maybe take a step back, because I'm throwing out DBT like everybody knows what that stands for. So DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's really sort of challenging the thoughts that we have so that we can also change our behaviors. And I like to think of it as CBT with mindfulness attached to it. So, I don't know. I always think of it as like, I have these intrusive thoughts, I have to have an intervention, and then that will change my behaviors. Is that how you kind of think of it too? I just want to
Yeah, I think so. DBT, is a kind of variant of traditional talk therapy, right? And it does focus on things like interpersonal effectiveness. How do you manage yourself in relationships with other people? The skills that you bring to do that. It does bring in skills like just tolerating distress and tolerating really difficult, intense emotions. The thing to know about DBT particularly, or dialectical behavioral therapy is what it stands for, is that DBT was a mode to really deal with people who had very, very intense emotional experiences. And it was a way to help kind of navigate, regulate those so that you can be effective in your life and relationships.
Absolutely. Okay. So I had kind of just a general question about body image. It's
All
my
right, bring it on.
it's my impression that women are very, very scrutinized for
Hmm.
their body composition, right? You have to have big boobs, and right now this like big butt trend is really, blossoming on Instagram, and tiny waist is emphasized as well. Do
Yeah.
you feel like men are under a similar level of scrutiny, or do you feel like, it's not really equal between the sexes?
Well, there's a difference between sort of equal between the sexes versus does it exist or not.
Okay.
I think the fact of the matter, and research has really backed up, is that, yeah, we as men are under intense body physical scrutiny as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not just something that is only for women, but men don't think about or worry about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Our struggles around that scrutiny and that physical body image type concerns may show up in a different way than it does with women, and the research does kind of support this. And those kind of concerns have certainly been on the rise in line with women's physical health body image concerns since about the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm an 80s kid, right?
Yeah, me too.
I grew up in the era of Sylvester Stallone movies,
Mm-hmm.
Jean-Claude Van Damme,
Mm-hmm.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, body pumping iron,
I always think of
the
Brad
Hulk
Pitt.
Hogan,
Fight Club. The Fight Club movie was so
the
big,
Fight
right?
Club.
And then
Yeah.
like Brad Pitt's super like cut, and that was sort of a thing that was big in my high school. I noticed boys started drinking creatine at that point. It was like
Yes.
that was this, I don't know, a new wave of sort of like, let's go to the gym, let's see how hard we can lift. That became almost like the new hanging out at the mall. It was like,
that was that kind of cultural pressure
Sure.
for men, right? And that women know this and speak about this very much too, right? There's a greater awareness, I think, of it. But for men, that stuff is there. It just tends to show up in a different kind of format, where much of it is about the aspects of muscularity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Of bulk and strength and weight, and even maybe a little bit height, but really in the areas of kind of muscularity.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen those kind of messages play out across the decades. I wish I sort of had it available. I may be able to sort of pull it up here in a second, but if I have to look too hard, I'll just skip over that. Like pictures of action figures from like the 80s to today, you can see the development. So you take like a Luke Skywalker doll from the 1970s, right? That has a sort of appropriately portioned body image.
Yeah.
But as the years go by, the proportions of even the action figures really, really change.
Sure.
And we've seen that in the same way and correlated with the way that toys traditionally for girls, say like a doll or Barbie doll, like her dimensions start shrinking. You see the male action figures bulking up.
Well, they're shrinking in the waist area. I don't know so much in the in the butt area. I don't,
right.
I think they were this. There was this impossible standard that no body could ever look like that. And if she did exist in real life, she would have to have 8 ribs removed and, breast implants for days and,
And you make such a good point, right? That the ideal body image that these kind of images are putting out there is physically impossible to attain without augmentation, without surgical procedures, or without, often in the case of men, steroid abuse.
Oh, right. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's been sort of this underground, very insidious issue that, only now are we really even talking about it, because, for even Arnold Schwarzenegger has come out and said, I've used steroids. Like, of course I have. Everybody has. If you don't, then you're dead meat in the weightlifting arena. So it was sort of this thing that you had to do just to be considered for certain parts,
Mm-hmm.
or a certain look, or a pro wrestler, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, yeah.
And I know I can speak to, for us as men, we tend to be so status hierarchy cued,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? To be so aware of where we kind of fit on the social hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
that has been such a big part of our socialization about, where you rank
That's such a good
and where
point.
you fit on the ladder.
Yeah.
And that is one kind of external measure of that we've almost kind of ingrained implicitly through our masculine socialization.
Yeah. I think the bigger you are, the more alpha you are, right?
I mean, that's the perception.
Right. And that's what perception is reality to a certain extent. So I think, if men and boys are perceived as, I'm going to be this alpha person, then I have to do the things that an alpha does. And I'm using the term alpha to mean, kind of muscular, top of the food chain type look, I guess. And I know that there are other ways you could use the word alpha, but I feel like there was this intense pressure, especially with things like Wolf of Wall Street and like those kind of movies, like sort of like, if you don't have billions of dollars, then the other way you can gain power is to be super muscular.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, you got to have one or the other. And how many people have billions of dollars?
I'm working on it.
Right. Yeah. Aren't we all? Anyway, okay. So are you seeing that in your practice at all, or that's not really coming up in many of your sessions?
That doesn't tend to be what men traditionally kind of come to me before, but I have seen that show up in my practice, where people have this kind of intense pressure to hit the gym. They tend to feel very insecure about their bodies. I've certainly, worked with partners who've sort of talked about, my husband he's almost obsessed with this, and it really gets in the way of our relationship to really connect with each other.
So I've noticed, well, back when I was a special ed teacher, because I was a high school special ed teacher for like 10 years, and some of my students with ADHD would use particularly running as a way to sort of diffuse that extra energy that they would have. And I noticed that when they were running and, track would start up, they were so much more focused in the classroom. But I wonder if there's a tipping point too, where maybe they become sort of obsessive about the running, because it's really doing a lot for their brain. I mean, it really did help them, focus. So I'm just wondering, is that a hard balance for people to manage?
I found in my folks, look, there's almost sort of different sort of frames and lenses here, right? Which is, look, in adults and kids with ADHD, we know that exercise is one of the best, natural medicines there is. So the idea of, having these kids who would run a lot to get that physical motion in there so that they could kind of focus their attention, right? And sort of in a way, the habitual nature of that becomes tantamount. But again, I think it's like just about everything in mental health, right? When you think about sadness, we all get sad.
Right.
But there's a difference between sadness and depression. Sure. When you think about anxiety, we all have times of feeling tense, keyed up, anxious. But there's a difference between just feeling anxious and having an anxiety disorder. There's a difference between drinking socially and having an alcohol use disorder. So many of these things are almost on a sort of quantitative level and even characteristically different than just your sort of typical range of stuff. So what you're looking for is, when do these things really become impairing? When do they become something that actually creates risk? In the case of kind of exercising, like, are they exercising to the exclusion of social relationships, occupational functioning? Are they exercising in a way that puts their health actually more at risk for greater experience of injuries, underweight type experiences, things like that? Those are the areas that you're kind of looking at. Less than the behavior itself is much more like, well, what are the consequences of the behavior?
Right. Okay. Well, I love what you said about exercise being the key many times to an ADHD issue, because I find that so powerful in people with high anxiety. I used to work in addiction, and it would be sort of the first thing we would recommend when somebody was having overwhelming cravings, was sort of like, okay, go work out for an hour and then see how you feel, that kind of thing. Because, often those endorphins are a really good substitute for the other things that we might go to. So,
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay, well, cool. So before we started recording, you had said that there is a higher rate of obesity in the population who has ADHD. I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit. And
I would be more than happy to speak to that. Okay, so having ADHD, I had a supervisor who once said, Jared, our greatest strengths and our greatest challenges flow from the same well. And I think ADHD can fit that model particularly. There are elements of, what ADHD is, the temperament and sort of the way our brain functions, that can be put to really good use, that can serve well in a number of ways. But I do think it's an over sort of exaggeration, perhaps, to say that, the ADHD is this gift, and that, it has these sort of good sides. Because the consequences that we know of are large. Absolutely. We know that from kids to adulthood with ADHD, there's much higher incidence of things like substance abuse, of death from car accidents, of marriages, not just first marriages, but second marriages and even third marriages. Sure. And to your point, obesity. Right. So let's talk about where eating disorders as well. But let's talk about where that might come from. Right. To get to that, you have to understand what is ADHD? What does that even mean? First of all, I think it's a really poorly named syndrome.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Right. I think the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is really poorly named.
Right. I often would tell parents in IEP meetings that maybe this label of ADHD is just your son being an 8-year-old boy, or whatever, or a 14-year-old boy or whatever, because I often would see that the child had a label of ADHD, and the person who showed up in class, yes, maybe couldn't pay attention, but I didn't think it was ever, so outlandish. The behavior was so outlandish that it deserved this label that carries a lot of stigma even now. We can't quite get rid of it, and because I think it's so poorly labeled.
And one of the key foundational aspects of ADHD is its variability, right? ADHD is not a constant. So parents or teachers could look at, little Johnny and say, Johnny can focus on the video games for hours. What do you mean attention problems? He doesn't have attention problems. He can play his video game for hours on end. He just doesn't want to pay attention at school. Yeah. Right? Or he just doesn't want to pay attention to homework. And the fact of the matter is that studies after studies, and there is a neurological basis, ADHD is one of the most researched conditions that we have. But the brain does operate, the brain's executive functioning system operates in a different way. Yeah. So there are two things that can really motivate the ADHD brain. And essentially, even More is this variability of motivation.
Mm-hmm.
There are two things. Either it feels like there's a gun to your head and you're under the clock that if you don't do this, there's an immediate consequence, right? That can often get folks with ADHD to act really well. Or it's something sort of intrinsically interesting to them, something that they're intrinsically care about.
Sure.
And not just because someone told them to care about it, like you should care about your schoolwork and you should care about getting good grades, but because it's intrinsically interesting to them.
Right.
And for some kids with ADHD, school is intrinsic. I mean, I was one of those. School was intrinsically interesting. I didn't have difficulties with schoolwork and problems like with that, because for the most part, schoolwork was inherently interesting, and that curiosity was.
Even math, Jared,
until calculus 1, right? I'm sorry. Let me go. Until the second semester of calculus. I was fine with, and now you're taking me back. I was fine with the first semester part, which was, derivatives.
Oh,
derivatives are different. I can't even remember at this point. The first semester of calculus, that's fine. By the second semester, forget it. It was like,
I loved school too, but I have to say math, and later I became a math teacher. I think it's because I wanted to prove that I could do it because I had failed miserably. I actually got a C in Algebra 1, and my mom made me retake it, and I was just mortified that I had to retake Algebra 1 as a high school freshman. And then I ended up teaching Algebra 1.
Yeah.
Because I was just like, you're not going to get me down, Matt. But anyway.
But let's translate this to what this means for eating and our health and our.
Sure.
Think about. Yeah, sure, no problem. I'm it's what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about what healthy diet, not diet in the sense of like having a diet, but healthy diet in terms of like food intake, preparation entails. That is a huge executive functioning task.
Oh my gosh, so much so. Yes, absolutely.
Organization, preparation, planning, execution, right?
Right.
ADHD is not a disorder of knowledge. ADHD has nothing to do with intelligence. It is not correlated, no correlation with intelligence. You can be super smart with ADHD. You can be not as intelligent with ADHD. You can be, like most people, average intelligence with ADHD.
Yes, right.
It's not a disorder of knowledge. So what you'll find is folks with ADHD will say, I know what I need to do. I know what I need to or should be eating. I know that I'm supposed to get fresh food that's non-processed, that, I prepare myself or is prepared. I know I'm supposed to plan ahead. I know I'm supposed to eat small meals through the day. They know those aspects. I know I shouldn't be, gorging on junk food, keeping healthy things in the house, all that sort of stuff. They know that stuff. It's not like you have to sit down and teach them that stuff.
Okay, well, I just
have
to give a disclaimer. My community is not anti-processed foods. We think binging on the couch is not binging, but eating on the couch and zoning out is a coping technique. But we don't have to get into all of that. In this scenario, the preferred behavior is eating fresh food and not eating too much and not zoning out on the TV, but sitting down to a meal.
Right.
Okay.
But executing that is different.
Yes, absolutely. I think they can picture the plate, but they can't think about all the components that go into making chicken and rice and broccoli. They can't put it all together. They might know something about making chicken, but then making also the rice at the same time and the broccoli and having it all come out hot at the same time. Too much.
Putting it all together, too much. Yeah. So two major components, right, of ADHD, the ignition switch. So getting started. I got to go to the grocery store.
Right. Oh, yeah.
as well as inhibiting, right? So the folks I work with ADHD and myself too fall into this. The grocery store is like stimulus overload mode.
Yeah. Sure.
It's right. There are a bunch of people around.
Yeah.
There's all of this stuff
Yeah.
to, right? We forgot our grocery list at home. We didn't think that to make a grocery list because we thought, we don't need to do that.
Right.
But the grocery store is like, I've had some folks describe that. It's like, it's just torturous
Oh.
because filtering out that kind of extra stimuli,
Yeah.
right? The ADHD brain, one of the big things you find is there's this kind of default mode in your brain. This is the neural activity that goes on when you ain't doing anything. Right. When you're just at rest, when you're not doing a task, it's not like your brain shuts off. It's like the Motel 6. It keeps the lights on for you. Right. Even if you're not doing something, your brain's still going.
Yeah.
But what happens with most quote unquote neurotypical folks is when they shift their attention to a task, right? And doing something active, like taking a math test or filling out a grocery list, that default network gets suppressed, right? So the activity there goes down while you're focusing on this task. In ADHD, that doesn't happen. That default mode stays really active.
Oh my gosh.
So
such good information. Yeah.
So the subjective experience of that is a lot of internal chatter.
Right.
Goes on. This is always running.
Right.
There's that internal chatter that goes on, plus the sensitivity to the environment where external stimuli may come in and redirect you from a number of different ways. So if that mode is activated and you're checking through the ketchup aisle, but then you think to yourself, I need to get pickles with and off I go.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
I can't wait until I'm in the pickle aisle. I have to go now before I forget this thing.
Exactly.
It's
but
like,
in going to the pickle aisle, you have forgotten the ketchup or probably the mustard that's sitting right next to it.
Wow. Okay. So making healthy meals for someone with ADHD is a really, really challenging task is what I'm hearing.
Can be. Yeah, absolutely. Again, unless because ADHD is so variable, unless you could be a world-class chef with ADHD. Sure. What's the difference? Right?
Intrinsic motivation, right?
The intrinsic motivation for it, right? Yeah. If you're a sort of world-class chef or you love doing that, that may be an area where you actually excel in because your attention, your motivation is really, really intensely focused on that. Yeah. You may still sort of have difficulty executing at some point, but if that's really intrinsically interesting, but for most of us, probably the majority of the population, I imagine, I include myself in it, cooking, is just not, it's not like we don't,
Yeah. Have you seen that meme that like adulthood is asking yourself what's for dinner every day for the rest of your life? And it's like, that's an overwhelming thing to think that I have to choose something to eat for dinner every day for the rest of my life.
For the rest of your life. You've got to
prepare it or get it or have it delivered it's.
And think ahead and plan and organize.
Meal planning in and of itself, I feel is like, and because I'm a big intuitive eater, that's kind of my specialty. I'm getting certified in intuitive eating. The body wants something different sort of every day. So then like meal planning is a little bit out the window because, maybe today I want chicken, but tomorrow I'm going to want pasta, and I have to just kind of roll with the punches and, ask my body's wisdom what it wants that day. I can imagine, I don't know if that would work for somebody with ADHD or not. If meal planning is too burdensome, maybe it would be better to be more of an intuitive eater so that you could sort of, ask your body what it wants and then not have to plan.
Well, again, some of the difficulty is that can both potentially work, but also potentially backfire, because a person with
Yeah,
ADHD may say, yeah, intuitively, I feel like eating this. I feel
yeah,
like having chicken and rice and broccoli today.
right.
Eh,
Yeah,
but the impetus to shift and get started to do that just feels kind of like too much,
yeah. Okay.
right?
Maybe they make
Um,
chicken, but they eat like wheat thins with the chicken or something. Something that was like pre-made or, you know.
and again, counter to the usual typical notion of we all think of folks with ADHD as bouncing off the walls and having all this energy and hyperactivity. But the fact of the matter is that a vast majority of folks with ADHD actually struggle with really heavy fatigue
Hmm.
and tiredness.
Is that because they have both of their systems going all the time, like the system that's in default mode and the system that has to take this math test right now? Both are running at full speed all the time. So I would imagine that eats up a lot of energy.
Yeah, I mean, that's one theory. I don't think we know the reasons for why these things occur this way in the way they do, but think about that. Yeah, these systems are kind of running all the time. That's a lot of kind of energy burn,
Mhm.
stuff like that. Sleep also is really, really affected. Um, trying to get to, people getting to sleep on time or shutting their brains off to get to sleep,
Mhm.
as opposed to staying up and doing some other interesting thing, or following Netflix till 1 a.m.
Sure.
So shutting that sort of circuit off.
Mm.
There is a higher incidence of kind of sleep movement type concerns, as well as the executive part of the executive functioning system is the thing in our brain that regulates our level of arousal and awakeness and alertness.
I see.
That this may be understimulated in folks with ADHD. So not only you got the energy burn, but you've also got a brain that the reticular activating system may not be, you again, this is areas of exploration, but may not be as actively functioning as it would in others.
Wow.
So that kind of fatigue can really set in. So even if they do check in with themselves, and most folks with ADHD can be bad at self-monitoring,
Yep.
um, but even if they check in with themselves and have that intuitive sense of what they want to, getting that ignition going to follow that becomes a challenge.
Well, I'm wondering if they intuitively wanted some certain food to eat, if that wouldn't become a little bit more intrinsically motivated because their body is. I don't know. I mean, just throwing that out there.
So great point. So this is one of the things that we do in ADHD therapy, right? Knowledge about how your brain works is really important. And when you have that knowledge of how your brain works, you can capitalize on that. So knowing this about yourself, one of the things that is helpful is to really visualize the rewards and make that kind of more immediate, make it more intrinsically valuable to someone. So maybe before they sit down to a meal, or as they're kind of thinking, to really work with a person to visualize what is it they value about their eating style, right? To really almost give visual and visceral picture of how good it will feel to have that prepared meal with that's warm and tastes good and feels nourishing to them, as opposed to just grabbing the easy thing.
Right.
And to kind of visualize and really make real the rewards that they'll feel from that, as opposed to what they might feel if they just sort of grab the easy, or kind of don't follow through on that plan. So visualizing those rewards,
What is
setting up systems
yeah.
that would make it easier to get that stuff, so that maybe the chicken's not buried in the back of the freezer,
Okay,
but
yeah.
that it's more sort of accessible to, and so that these things become habitual over time.
So you're like lowering the impediments to the reward
Absolutely.
while also creating this really dazzling visual of what it would be like to have the reward.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. That's one of your main techniques, I would imagine, to having people sort of adapt to having ADHD and still functioning pretty highly in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay because here are some steps.
And yeah, and exactly. That's part I talked about earlier, is this kind of skills training aspect of the therapy, this kind of coaching skills training aspect of how to sort of adapt your life to understand how your brain functions and, get more done and feel better about what you get done and systematize things. And that's just one example of a number of different range of executive functioning type skills that you incorporate in the therapy.
So what about when they can't make the chicken and the rice and the broccoli and they do grab something that is more processed, maybe not quite as desirable nutritionally or for nourishment, but instead, they opt for sort of the easy thing. I would imagine there could be some shame attached to eating processed foods and not making yourself the chicken and rice and broccoli.
Let's talk about shame.
Yay.
Right? Because adults with ADHD, and I don't work with kids. I can't really speak to this so much with kids because I do work in the adult realm of this. But let's talk about shame in adults with ADHD in particular, because that has been, in my experience, a daily, typical narrative thread of our lives.
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely. Because
oftentimes a lot of, the folks I work with may have been diagnosed as kids, but a lot of times they weren't. Or, these things started to show up maybe more later in life. When you look back, there are signs and things there, but they may not necessarily have had trouble or really bad grades in school or stuff like that. Maybe a little bit of variability, but it's not like it was constantly they were failing out of school and therefore there was an intervention. I tend to work with folks who can be very, very, very bright, but they have known their whole lives that there's almost this pervasive sense of something wrong with themselves, feeling unsuccessful, feeling underachieved, feeling like they've been made to feel lazy or like a space cadet or like a spaz, or that they're too sensitive or too much, that they are...
all the words, right? All the euphemisms that we use that are nicer than saying, hey, you're a brat,
all the moral judgments that are put upon. So shame with folks with adult ADHD is exquisite part of this process.
Well, I have found that a lot of people who eat processed foods as the majority of their diet, they also feel a lot of shame. Whether they have ADHD or not, they are feeling like, I'm not making the right food choices, I'm not respecting my body, I'm a terrible person. Or they'll say, I was bad last week because I had X food. Usually it's like a baked good or ice cream or something. So I'm always trying to reclaim that food is neither good nor bad. It has no morality associated with it. And if you choose to eat cake, that does not make you bad. You're not being bad. You're just nourishing yourself in a particular way. And the next day it might be totally different. But what do you say to people with ADHD who feel this exquisite shame?
So a big part of it's not so much what I say, but how do I approach it? Is I tend to approach it a bit like a scientist, right? Okay. And let's put the judgment of it aside for a minute, and let's approach this like a scientist and see if we can use this to learn from and get some information from, right? And you're always balancing this kind of acceptance and change piece, right? Dialectical behavior therapy is all about balancing the acceptance and the change piece. This acceptance for yourself of who you are. And maybe sometimes we do go into like childhood, early origin biographical stuff about how that shame messages, they were taught about shame, how they relate to those messages, where those messages came from, speaking back to some of those messages. I do some experiential work, like putting a critic in another chair and dialoguing with that critic type self. So that's a huge element of the work that I do.
In there?
functionally, from the skills sort of perspective, it's also about using the stuff as information. So let's look together at what happened, right? If you ended up eating cake and you didn't want to, but you did.
Sure.
Let's troubleshoot, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be judgmental. It doesn't have to be shameful, but maybe that's good information for us to look at what happened, right? You know, does this fit with part of your motivation? Is your motivation for something flagging? Does that make sense? Was this a system process issue that the cake was sitting out there on the counter, but the food that you wanted to eat was at the grocery store and you hadn't gotten it on your last run? Those kind of things.
I
right?
do that all the time myself. I reframe things as a learning opportunity. And it really does take the shame piece out of it, because scientists, when they look at a problem and they have a hypothesis and they're testing the hypothesis, they're not putting any judgment on the outcome. And so I think that we're kind of used to doing that in school. The scientific method is really beaten into us in a good way, that we know that, you know, whatever the outcome, it's not personal.
Yeah.
And that's what this needs to be. It's not personal.
Exactly. And sometimes this stuff comes up not as an organizational failure. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's an emotional challenge that shows up.
Absolutely.
Well, I went to eat the cake because I was bored.
Right.
Boredom is huge in ADHD. Or I went because I was really, really sad. Right?
Yeah.
And then when you approach that like a scientist and you sort of break that down and understand that, you may think about, okay, well, what happened emotionally? Let's talk about that. How do we understand that? You know, what was going on for you? How are you coping with boredom these days? And those kind of elements, right? Sometimes it's that emotional system that doesn't have the brake on it.
It puts so much power back with the client too, because then they can think about their choices, you know, everything leading up to how they chose what they did. And then, you know, you're right, it's good information for them to think about next time I'm bored, what am I going to do? You know, and you know, I like to ask clients, and this is from one of my supervisors, she said, what percentage of choices are moving you forward, moving you into the life that you want to lead? You know, so she does this life worth living scale, and I'll probably go into it in another video, but you know, I love that she kind of turns it around on the client and says, you know, what percentage of choices are really, you know, informing, you know, your life? How are you making choices so that you lead the life that you really love? And I just I love that question, and I loved everything that you had to say today. Thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. I think your ideas and the way that you present them, how you've crystallized knowledge around ADHD is really unique and
thank you.
Really amazing. So what a gift for you to come on today and share this with everybody. It was really...
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it was really awesome. Tell people where to find you.
So you can find me, my website is jareddefife.com. You can find me on Facebook as well, and on Instagram. I'm starting to get into the Instagram and doing some things on there at Atlanta Psychologist.
Oh, fabulous. Well, great. I'm on Instagram as well at Food Counselor. And Jared Defife, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you later.